So there's a huge misconception out there that by going through these paces and doing a proper risk assessment, this huge misconception is, oh man, that's going to eat up so much of my time. I don't have time for that. And that's simply not true. We want you to go home to your family at the end of the day in better condition than when you got here.
Hey, and welcome back to the Electrical Safety Podcast. I'm your host, John Travis, and today I'm speaking with Steve Evans. Steve is a trainer at EBSCO currently, and I guess Steve will just get right into it. Why don't you share with the audience kind of your background, how you ended up in electrical safety, and maybe how you got here today.
Hey, thanks for having me, John. Pleasure. We've been trying to do this for a while now, but my schedule, as you know, a trainer, I'm all over the place, Monday through Friday, all over the country. So how did I become here? So I wasn't always a safety person, a safety nerd, I call myself, because kind of what I am. I came up in the construction trades, electrical trades many years ago. So what drove me towards a safety path, unfortunately, there was a very unfortunate and profound incident that happened. I was working as a plant maintenance electrician at a local cement plant, and I was apprenticing under my brother-in-law, and he ended up getting hurt really bad. He got burnt up with 1,800-degree raw cement material pouring down, filling the room on top of him. And I was in that same room probably seconds or minutes prior. And so, it's unfortunate that it takes a bad event to happen to change our minds. So after that, man, I thought real hard about it, and I just decided, I need to change. I need to change it up, because I was in that same room, and that could have been me just as easily. And, we were doing everything. We were doing everything wrong, but we were doing quite a bit wrong. We didn't lock anything out. There was bad communication. One thing led to another. They did a startup in the control room, and they started the process, and it started the flow. And here we are today. So I went back to school while, still working full time. Got my associates in OSHA. Figured that wasn't enough, so I kept going, using my GI Bill from the Marine Corps, and I ended up with my bachelor's degree in occupational safety and health. And the doors opened wide up, the floodgates opened, man, and I was quickly recruited to be a EHS manager. I did the EHS manager role officially for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. And in that 6 and 7 years doing the EHS role, I always found myself gravitating. I would always go towards the electrical, man. Every time I was doing an audit or an inspection, I would hyper focus on the maintenance guys and picking apart their electrical. And then I found out about this certification through NFPA, which is really cool. The Certified Electrical Safety and Compliance Professional. And I looked at the criteria, and I was like, oh man, that's going to be a tall order. So I started preparing, and I probably prepared for that for a good 1.5 to 2 years before I had the competence and the required hurdles to apply for it. So I applied for that, and once I got that, a very good friend of mine, him, Jason Brosen, reached out, and I got hired on with SCO as a 70E trainer and a kind of a all around guy. I do the lead audits now. I do a lot of training. So that's kind of how I got here today. It's been a long road, but it's awesome, man. Whole new world.
No, that's great. And so just kind of going back, so you did mention, so you started your career in the electrical trade. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, at a very young age. I was apprenticing probably when I was 17, 18 years old under my brother-in-law. who got
Okay.
burnt up. He survived, by the way. He got permanently disfigured and got a really big payout, but that doesn't wash away the all the hidden stuff that goes with that, the PTSD and the lifelong injuries.
Okay. So that kind of got your start in safety. And then yeah, I was curious as to why you were drawn to the electrical so much, but it's because you've got a background there. That's something, I don't see that very often. Probably the opposite when it comes to a health and safety manager role or typically the electrical kind of gets overlooked,
Yeah.
right? And so that's kind of interesting.
Over the years, I found that while wearing that EHS manager hat, um, I was extremely successful, and I attribute that to uh, I spoke the tribal language of the maintenance folks, man, because I was a wrench turner in the field, and
Mhm.
I think that went a long way with street cred. Uh,
Yeah.
that I wasn't just another guy with a degree coming in from college. It's I've been in those trenches doing the same type of stuff that they do, and I still do it from
Yeah.
time to time. I have a couple of good friends that own their local businesses. When they need help with a, a big wire pull or something, or I'll come out and help them out and just stay
Mhm.
fresh.
No, that's great. And then I'm curious about that certification. So you mentioned it's a really tall order. I mean, what are some of the things that you need to do to prepare for that, and what are the requirements?
Well, first off, and I can't name it off the top of my head, but you have to prove uh, hours worked in the electrical trade, uh, and you have to prove so many hours serving as a safety professional. So it's an open book test, which was I thought, oh man, this is gonna be a piece of cake, and then I started studying. No, it's not a piece of cake. You have to know that 70E. You don't have to know it like the back of your hand, but you have to know where to find the information, know where to
Mhm.
reference it. And they give you 4 hours, and I forget how many questions it is. Maybe, I don't know. It's over 100 questions. Uh,
Mhm.
and it's a proctored exam. So I passed it the first time, did really good at it, knocked it out of the park. Um, I, I don't know how I pulled that off, but
Yeah.
it was tough.
Well, if you spend enough time preparing for it, I'm sure.
I lived in that
You
book. I studied that thing for a year and a half.
So, along with the training, you mentioned audit. Now, this is something that I know had a lot of questions about over the years, but let's talk about, what are you kind of looking at when you do, and would you say it's an electrical safety audit? Is that what you call it?
Absolutely. So it's a deep
Yeah.
dive into not only their electrical safety programs, their written programs, but it's a very detailed walk of the entire facility. And I'm looking for everything. And I hyper focus on the three-legged stool analogy and the NFPA 70E, and that's the three books, the three standards that should be a part of your program is, one, your PS70 safe work practices. And then now, in early 2023, the PA70B, that's for maintenance related practices. That used to be titled as a recommended practice. Now, early 2023, it's a standard, so it's right up there with 70E. And lastly, I look at installs, and I look for National Electrical Code NFPA 70. So that three-legged stool, that's kind of the analogy of what your programs should. That's the backbone of it. So I'm looking for
Right.
all of that stuff. And what's very interesting, John, is I just now got from my authorized, I'm an OSHA authorized outreach trainer for general industry through UC San Diego, and my at home office sends out updates, and I'll share these with you. The latest industry standards show, and these are hot off the press in 2023. OSHA is now starting to cite and this landed in the top 10, they're starting to cite and issue citations for 70B and mostly initial installs. So once this, I have a feeling once this NFPA 70B maintenance practices gains momentum, because right now it hasn't even really started going yet. But once it starts getting momentum, man, it's gonna take off like wildfire. And it's caused somewhat of a rift between safety folks and maintenance folks, because here the safety folks are saying, "Hey, are you living up to your maintenance requirements?" And 9 times out of 10, they're not. Annual shutdowns, thermography, torque check, vacuuming, cleaning. We're talking about a very intensive shutdown event to where most companies are going to be challenged with doing that, right?
For sure.
So when it gains momentum, man, there's going to be some contractors out there that can specialize in thermography and preventative maintenance events that are there's going to be some pretty rich opportunity for folks.
Yeah. So let's back that up a step. So we mentioned 3 standards. You got 70, 70E, and 70B. And my understanding would be you want to follow 70 when you're building something new.
Yeah. So the 70 is your initial install. That's the National Electrical Code. That's what your contractors are going to use. Or if you have internal maintenance folks that are going to do initial installs, that's the code that they have to live up to. That's what the building inspectors are going to come look at and make sure it's installed according to the National Electrical Code NFPA 70.
Right. And then 70E, we're talking about safe work practices when we're doing, maybe it's initial installs, maybe it's commissioning work, maybe it is maintenance work, but this is not so much how to do the work, but how to do it safely.
Exactly. So a lot of folks, so in our training, we relate why it's important says OSHA does a really good job at saying you shall. They lay it out in very prescriptive language. NFPA 70 is your, I'm sorry, 70E is your roadmap on how to achieve that compliance. So they kind of live together, they commingle. OSHA tells you, hey, employers, you have to provide a workplace free of recognized hazards that are causing or likely, how it goes, the OSHA Act of 1970. Well, that's kind of vague. Employers, they look at that and they're like, okay, how do I achieve that? That's where we hold up the book 70E and say, this is your roadmap to success. That's how you achieve compliance. Well, it's not the only way, but it's the gold standard. And
yeah, it's probably the most recognized standard in the US and maybe in the world when it comes to electrical safety. And so, and just for people that are listening, like when it gets to 70B, so now we're talking about maintenance. So this is the maintenance that you should be doing, or is it you shall be doing on your electrical equipment to make sure that it, it's in good working condition. And what's the big deal that now that it's gone from sort of a guidance document to a standard? Like what does that mean in legal terms?
Well, I mean, I couldn't really speak to the legal terms. It's opinion over the years. There's been cases where, unfortunately there's incidents happening and people are getting injured. And when they do their root cause analysis, when OSHA comes out or whatever regulatory entity comes out and starts doing the investigation, they find, hey, the OEM user manual, the user guidance says this switchgear is in a filthy environment. Say it's in a cement plant and it gets super dirty. Well, in order to keep that stuff safe and operating at its safe parameters, you got to do these annual shutdowns. So in short, I think people were getting injured and they could tie it to a lack of preventative or predictive maintenance. So that's sheer opinion at this point. So I think that's a huge contributing factor of why the 70B was now born into the standard world and no longer just a recommended practice. Because when you say
Okay.
recommended practice, there's some maintenance chiefs out there. They're like, that's nice. I don't have time for that. I'm not going to do that.
Oh yeah, no, that's for sure. I mean, something that just even in the safety world in general, let alone, maintenance might be a little easier, not easier to understand, but if you don't do maintenance on certain things, obviously it's not going to work very
And
good.
I've read that. I've
Uh,
gone through that book and I have it here close somewhere. It's usually within arm's reach of me. They must mention, and I'll paraphrase, if they if it's 100, it's 500, and that's a guesstimation. But they mention this verbiage of, if I could sum it up, if I could sum up that 70B book, um, follow the user guidance. Get a hold of your OEM manual. You can get a hold of it through the supplier, whoever built your gear, or you can hit the Google button and you can find them and download them. And over the 8 months that I've been teaching this now, the 70B, its managers are now figuring it out and just making folders on their desktop and getting on the Google and dragging these OEM user guidance manuals
right.
into their folders. Because I can tell you this, from what I know, as an OSHA person, also an authorized outreach trainer, if you're not doing your maintenance, um, you're probably going to get away with it until the day that you don't. And what I mean by
Hmm.
that is, if God forbid something happens and you blow up some switchgear due to lack of maintenance, you'll probably get away with it uh, if nobody gets hurt. But the second somebody gets hurt, I promise you, uh, the government folks are going to ask, I want to see your maintenance logs. I want to see your maintenance records.
Let's switch gears a little bit, go back to the safety world and to training. So how long has it been now that you've been doing the electrical safety training?
Well, I taught it as an EHS manager. So I started, it's probably been 5 years, 5, 6 years.
Okay.
But since,
Okay.
Transitioning over to just electrical safety, I've been doing it full time for 8 months now for EBSCO. But I've been teaching the 70E on different levels. Yeah, for 5 or 6 years.
Have you kind of noticed anything, I guess, just in general over those 5 years as a big shift? Or do you find people are really just still in the same place that they were 5 years ago? Like, what's your general feeling on that?
I noticed, so at first, it seemed kind of stale, and people really, weren't perking up to it and weren't warming up to it. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, I really think there's been a shift. People are paying more attention. They're reaching out. They're getting training. Uh, the industry stats show there's a significant downward curve of injuries and citations. Um, they're still going on. People are still getting hurt and things are still happening, but I think there's employers are getting more involved and they're reaching out and they're getting professional training. So that downward curve I talk about, I like to attribute that to, what we're doing here right now. You and I talking about this, and then you getting this message out there. It works. And like I tell my students, don't let my time with y'all, the very last 4 hours that I have with them, don't let that be the only time that you're talking about electrical safety. You should be doing that daily, if not 2, 3 times a day. Every time you're going to have an exposure, you need to be doing a risk assessment. I took a hard left. Did I answer your question?
No, it's good. You made me think of a new one anyway. So the I know every safety trainer probably has maybe a couple of things that they really like to stress in every course, or they really like to talk about. So just out of curiosity, what would those things be for you when it comes to electrical safety?
So first off, there's man, the 70E course, it's tons of data and information. It's fed by a fire hose, man. Um, so there's definitely what I call the meat and potatoes or the taters and gravy moment, the things that you need to take home that are absolutely imperative that you remember from this training. And uh, if I had to pick some, it would absolutely be no. You got to know how to do your risk assessments. Uh, you got to know how to read your labels, and if you don't know how to read your labels and figure out the proper PPE that you have to have that exposure, then you got to dig into the tables method, and that's a whole different method on determining proper
Mm-hmm.
PPE and incident energy and boundaries. So, risk assessments, which there's a lot that goes into a risk assessment, but it's not rocket surgery. It's super easy to do if you know how to do it. PPE, your proper PPE, have a plan. Um, and the big one for me, I always circle back to the justification question. I Going to the very top of the hierarchy of risk controls. You should always be striving to eliminate the exposure altogether. You need to be asking yourself, if I turn this off, am I going to introduce greater risk or hazard to human beings or environmental on a grand scale? So you got to be justified. And if you can't answer that, if you're not justified by, working energized, then you need to create what we call that electrically safe work condition. Justification is probably the biggest one for me. Like recently there's here in my home state, and it's all over social media and the news. There was an unfortunate incident at a Home Depot, and a guy got arc flashed. And when my good friend Jason Brosen shared that with me, I immediately thought, dude, it's a Home Depot. Why can't you turn that off?
Right.
I mean, why can't you wait? Home Depot closes. I know they close their doors at night. Why couldn't they just reschedule that work to where they could shut the power off and do it in a electrically safe work condition?
Yeah.
And we don't know all the details to that. It's just, it's a, it's a excellent talking point, also, but of course our thoughts and prayers go out to that worker. I hate it. I hate it when I hear of anybody getting injured, especially when it could have been very, very preventable.
Yeah. Well, especially working in this industry, sort of you're going to come across that a lot, right? And you're always kind of hearing about it,
Yeah,
and you're constantly striving to make a difference and make people aware, but inevitably it still seems to happen. So, um, yeah, maybe not to dwell on that Home Depot incident, um, but just for people, yeah, because that was going to be my next question. Like, well, what were they doing? And so, what do you find for your students are the hardest tasks for them to, the kind of the ones that they're like, well, we've always done it this way. What are those
Mhm.
ones that you kind of got to walk them through and be like, no, no, this is not right. Is there anything that comes to mind there?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. So one of the biggest challenges is that, so there's a huge misconception out there that by going through these paces and doing a proper risk assessment, this huge misconception is, oh man, that's going to eat up so much of my time. I don't have time for that. And that's simply not true. There's y'all get paid by the hour, right? And honestly, there's nothing out there. There's nothing out there. I don't care what industry it's in, construction or general industry. There's nothing out there that's worth you putting your life at risk. It's cliche, but I'm going to say it again. We want you to go home to your family at the end of the day in better condition than when you got here. So one of the biggest challenges that is defeating that misconception of you're doing a risk assessment. It's, man, honestly, if you have labels and you have the data and the tools necessary, you can do a risk assessment on a piece of gear in
Hmm.
minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, man. Uh, NFPA puts out free templates on how to do these things so your risk assessment, 99% of the stuff needed on a risk assessment is on a proper energized electrical work permit. The only difference is if you're testing and troubleshooting, you don't need to get signatures. You
Right.
don't need approval. That's one of the exceptions for the permit. But I push it and say, look, if you do a risk assessment, you're doing this permit anyway.
Mhm.
So you might as well just go through the paces. And in the class, I actually pull out a permit and I print it off to everybody, and we do a scenario, and I give them data and I give them labels and stickers and say, here, we're going to pretend like we're going to go out in the field and do this work. I want you to fill out this permit. And even for guys that have never done it, I'm timing them and I say, how long do you think that took? 10 minutes for new students tops. And I said, you just did your risk assessments.
Yeah. So they definitely, that is a good point. Well, time is one of them. The other one might be, the concern that they get bogged down in paperwork and they've got forms coming out of the yin yang. But that's a good point. You mentioned and I've seen that before, is you have it all on one. So you have one document, one energized work permit, and then depending on the level of risk, you can either have different people sign off on it. So let's say it's a really low risk, kind of a routine task. You could even have the electrical worker sign off that, yeah, this is low risk, routine task. I know what I'm doing, and you still have signatures in that case.
Sure.
But yeah, so um, you mentioned, I'm curious about the table method because I know you're right. When you have labels on, that risk assessment is a heck of a lot easier. How do you find your students catching on to the table method and using it, or have you seen anyone use it with any great success?
Sure. So the table method can be tricky, man. It's easy to get in the weeds on that. So the way that I've found success on teaching and using that table method is kind of like a version of what I just said about scenario-based training, and you go through the energized work permit. Well, with the table method, we have ways of walking the students through the table method and giving them case study scenarios to where they are forced to. So the table method, you have to dig for data. You have to go to the one line draw, find information. You got to figure out available fault current, incident energy, boundaries. There's a ton that goes into using the table method. And if you don't do it regularly, it's easy to forget. It's perishable knowledge. So
Hmm.
when I teach the method, it's way longer than a 4-hour session. Way longer. It's only a day and a half.
Yeah. But that is something, I guess what I've sort of noticed is people that say that they're using the table method aren't actually, they're not doing all that extra stuff that you just mentioned. So they're just going to this table, that table, gone.
John, it's super easy to lose interest halfway through, because using the table method, it's going to take some time. That is not a 5-minute risk assessment. You're talking significant time before you do a task to sit down and bust out the tables and start making notes.
Right.
Huge difference. That's why the NFPA 70E folks have put it out there. The incident energy analysis method is the preferred method. So we encourage folks to get a reputable company, get a subject matter expert to do those calculations for you. And by the way, those calculations aren't for everybody. Yeah, I'm talking about the ones in the back of the book. Those are not for me. Those are for electrical engineers or someone highly qualified to do those calculations. That's why we encourage folks, if you don't have labels and you haven't had an incident energy study done at your facility, we highly encourage that you get one done, because having the labels 99% of the data that you need, like I said earlier, to do that risk assessment is already on those labels, providing that they're good labels.
Yeah, and to be honest, I hadn't even thought about that. Um, Kind of a benefit to getting the labels done is it's going to speed up your risk assessment.
Oh,
Sounds like,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Like I said, it's super easy for a maintenance guy to lose interest halfway through getting the tables, because if you don't know it, man, it can be frustrating.
Hmm.
It can be frustrating. And when we do the table method teaching, um, it's not just one scenario. It's not just one case study. I run them through 6 or 8 scenarios.
Hmm.
And by that last one or second to last one, they're starting to click and they're starting to get it and they're starting to understand. But on the very first one, they're like, their eyes are spinning. There's so much data going on. The gears are smoking, man. I
Yep.
remember the very first time that the tables method was taught to me. I sat through a class. God bless our electrical engineers. We need them. But the problem with this one class, it was taught by a super intelligent, great guy, electrical engineer, but he taught the class, which was a room full of maintenance guys. He taught to the class like we were also electrical engineers. And I didn't get anything out of that class. I was like, wow, I feel dumber for sitting in this class now. So that's one of the things that it's important to know the tribal language of the maintenance folks, so you can sit down with them and run them through these scenarios. And I think that's one of the most satisfying things, is when the light bulb starts to come on and they're like, oh man, it's not that hard. Okay, I can do this. I can do the tables, or I
Hmm.
can do a risk assessment. It's not going to take 2 minutes, 2, 3 minutes.
Oh man, I think that's pretty cool. I mean, that kind of sums up most everything I wanted to talk about. The last thing I'll ask is, if you have, anything kind of going on coming up that you'd like to share with the audience. I know you mentioned you're going to be tackling the IEEE conference.
I've been to, God, countless OSHA safety summits, VPP summits, voluntary protection program summits. But this is one of the ones that I'm really looking forward to. A good friend of mine, Caitlin Hetzel from Herzig, reached out, just asked me, hey, are you going to this thing? Is APSCO going to this thing? I'm like, I don't know. I
Yeah.
asked my boss, and he's like, heck yeah, let's do it. So I'm really looking forward to that. Looking forward to some of the breakout sessions, and just meeting and hanging out with like-minded folks, like-minded safety people, safety nerds, so to say, electrical
Yeah.
safety nerd.
Yeah. No, someone told me once it's the Super Bowl of electrical safety. So
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to
we'll
it.
for people listening, I guess we'll put a link in the show notes there. Steve, is there, somebody wants to reach out to you if they got any questions, where's the best place to find you?
Oh man, Steve.Evans, EBSCO.co, or you can, you know what? I'll share my LinkedIn profile. You can get me on there. Um,
Yep.
I'm always looking to connect and chat with like-minded folks.
Perfect. No, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having you on. And
Absolutely, man. Thanks for reaching out, and we'll talk to you soon.
yeah, thanks.
Bye
Have
bye.
a good one.